Everybody in our valley thought they knew how Lena Whitcomb's life was going to end. Alone, with the radio on, a dog she'd outlive, and a house that smelled like cut hay and nobody. They thought that because a man stood up in front of God and the whole county and decided she was too old to bother with. I was there the day he said it. I have spent the years since wishing I'd been somewhere else, and then being glad I wasn't, because somebody had to remember it right. So I'll tell you what really happened. Not the version they tell at the feed store. The true one. It's about a woman who got handed the cruelest thing a person can be handed. The news that she had run out of time to be wanted, and what she did with it. And it's about a quiet man with bad hands and a good heart who looked at the exact same woman everyone else had given up on, and could not, for the life of him, understand what they were looking at. Stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better. But it does get better, and that's the part nobody believes until they hear the whole thing. The morning it broke, I was counting fence posts that didn't need counting. That's a habit of mine. When something is about to go wrong and I can't stop it, I find a chore that doesn't matter and I do it slow. My late wife used to call it hiding in plain work. I had a ledger in my coat pocket that day. I keep one, always have. A little canvas-bound book where I write down the weather and how much rain we didn't get and which cows are limping. I'd written that morning clear, no wind, frost on the low ground, and then under it in smaller letters because I was ashamed of writing it at all. Royce is going to do something stupid today. I can feel it like a barometer. I was right about the barometer. I am right about the weather maybe 4 days out of 10, but I was right about that. Royce Aldridge had asked Lena to marry him in October, on the porch of her daddy's old place, with the cottonwoods going gold behind him. I know because Lena told me, and Lena did not tell things she didn't mean. She'd come over to return a post-hole digger she'd borrowed in the spring and never gave back, and she stood in my doorway with that tool in her hand like it was a bouquet, and she said, "Cole." He asked me. And then she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the belly and surprises the person it comes out of, and she said, "At my age, can you believe it?" At my age. She said it like a joke, like a small miracle she didn't quite trust. Lena was 46 that fall. She'd spent 20 of those years running a boarding stable on land that took more than it gave, fixing her own engines, pulling her own calves on the 3 cows she kept for company, and burying, one at a time, every person who was supposed to outlast her. Her mother, then her father, then a brother who went to Reno and came back in a box. By 46 she had hands like a man's and a back that talked to her when it rained and a face that had been left out in the weather of an entire life. And it was, I want to be clear about this, a beautiful face. Not the kind they sell you, the kind you earn. And Royce Aldridge, who had 400 head and a new truck every 2 years, and a mother still alive at 90 who'd never once approved of anybody, had stood on that gold-lit porch and asked her to be his wife. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She'd been alone a long time, and being alone is a thing you can do, but it's not a thing the body forgets to be tired of. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in November. Small. The little white church on the county road, the one with the bell that's been cracked since before I was born so it goes thunk instead of ding. Folding chairs. Pie afterward in the fellowship hall. Lena had bought a dress in town, pale gray, not white. "I'm too old for white," she'd said, laughing again, always laughing about the age like if she got there first the word couldn't hurt her. She asked me to walk her down the aisle, on account of her father being 12 years in the ground, and I said yes before she finished asking. I'd known her since she was a barefoot kid stealing my windfall apples. Walking her down that aisle was going to be one of the good things I got to do before I died. I'd already decided that. I want you to hold onto that picture, the gray dress, the cracked bell, me with my boots polished for the first time since my own wife's funeral. Because here is what happened instead. 3 days before the wedding, Royce's mother had what the family called a turn, and what the doctor in town called nothing wrong with her that getting her way wouldn't cure. And Royce, who was 53 years old and still flinched when his mother said his name in a certain tone, drove up to Lena's place on a Wednesday afternoon with the heater running and the windows up. I was there. I'd come to help Lena move some panels, and I was in the barn aisle when his truck pulled in, and I watched through the gap in the boards because I am not too proud to admit I watch things. He didn't get out for a long minute, sat there with his hands on the wheel. When he finally came out, he walked like a man walking to a hanging, and not his own. I couldn't hear all of it. The wind came up. I'd been wrong about no wind, and it took some of the words. But I heard enough. I heard mother, and I heard think about the future, and I heard the word that did it, the word that I have not been able to put down in all the years since, the word he said while he looked at the toes of his boots and not at her face. "Children," he said, "Lena, be reasonable. At your age there isn't going to be. I need an heir for the place. Mother's right, I have to think about." And Lena said, very quietly, in a voice I'd never heard her use, a voice with all the laugh scooped out of it, "You knew how old I was in October." He didn't have anything for that. Men like Royce never do. They make the decision in the dark of their own fear, and then they come out into the daylight and act surprised the sun is shining on it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am, but I can't build a future on. I need someone who can give me." "Say it." Her voice didn't rise. That was the terrible part. It got lower. "If you're going to do it, Royce, do it standing up. Say what I'm too old for." He couldn't. He just shook his head and said the thing men say, which is, "I think this is best for everyone," as though there were a room full of people benefiting and not one woman in a barnyard with her whole chest caving in. Then he got in his truck, and he drove away. And the dust hung in the cold air a long time, the way dust does when there's no wind to take it, and I stood in the barn with a fence panel in my hands like a fool, and Lena stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, and neither of us moved for what felt like the length of a season. "I want to tell you," she screamed, or threw something, or cussed him down the road in language that would have peeled the paint off his new truck. That's what the story wants, isn't it? That's the version that's easy to root for. She didn't do any of that. She just stood there until the cold got into her, and then she turned around and saw me standing in the barn, and she did the thing that broke me worse than any screaming could have. She apologized. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said. "You came to help with panels." And she went and picked up her end of the panel, hands shaking so bad the metal rang, and she said, "Where do you want this one?" Like the world hadn't just told her she was a thing past its season, a tractor too old to register, a dog you don't replace the collar on. I set my end down. I said, "Lena." "Don't." She didn't look at me. "Cole, I swear to God, if you're kind to me right now, I will come apart, and I have got animals to feed before dark. So don't. Just help me with the panel." So I helped her with the panel. We worked till the light went orange and then gray. We didn't talk. That's a thing women like Lena and men like me understand that the rest of the world has forgotten. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person in agony is to hand them a job and stay quiet, and let them keep their dignity in their hands while their heart does what it has to do behind their face. When I left full dark, I sat in my truck at the end of her drive, and I wrote in my ledger by the dome light with my reading glasses fogging up. I wrote, "Royce called it off. Said she's too old. He's a coward, and I told him nothing because telling him would have cost her more than it cost him." And then I sat there a while longer, and I wrote one more line, and I have never shown it to a living soul until now. A woman that good should not have to find out she's invisible. Somebody ought to see her, somebody with eyes. I didn't know, writing it, that somebody already had for months. Had been seeing her so plainly and so completely that he'd half worn a path to her place doing favors he invented just to be near her, and had never said one word, because he thought a woman like that would never look twice at a man like him. But I'm getting ahead. Let me go back and bring him in proper, because he deserves it. His name was Eli. You wouldn't have noticed Eli Reyes in a room. That was the first thing about him, a kind of carefulness, like a man who'd learned young that taking up space got you noticed and being noticed got you hit. He was about Lena's age, give or take, hard to say. He shod horses and built fence and fixed the things on the ranches around here that broke in the gap between can wait and call somebody real. A widower. His wife, Connie, had died of the slow cancer about 6 years back. And after that Eli had gone even quieter, which I wouldn't have thought possible. He had bad hands. I should explain that because it matters later. Years of horseshoeing and barbed wire had left his hands swollen at the knuckles and crooked, the fingers turning in like the roots of a tree that grew up against a rock. They hurt him. You could see it some mornings, the way he flexed them slow before he could close them around a tool. He never complained. That wasn't in him. But I'd seen him stop, working on a shoe, and just hold his own hand in his other hand for a second, like comforting something, before he went on. Eli had been doing odd work at Lena's place going back 2 years. It started honest. She'd hired him to shoe her boarding horses, but it kept on past honest into something else. He'd show up to do one job and find 3 more that needed doing, and he'd do them. And when she tried to pay him, he'd say it was nothing, hardly worth the gas, and drive off before she could argue. I'd put it together a while before any of this. Old men have nothing to do but watch. I'd seen the way Eli's truck found reasons to go past Lena's. I'd seen him, at the co-op, light up and then go careful when her name came up. I'd seen him bring her, one time, a sack of those little hard pears off his own tree. And the way he held that sack, you'd have thought it was full of eggs, or diamonds, or his whole hopeless heart. He never said a word to her. Why would he? In Eli's accounting of the world, Lena Whitcomb was a woman engaged to Royce Aldridge, a man with 400 head and 2 good hands. Eli was a fellow with crooked fingers and a dead wife and a name people forgot. He'd no more have spoken his feelings out loud than he'd have walked into that white church and pulled the cracked bell down on his own head. So he watched her get engaged to another man, and he was glad for her. I'll testify to that under oath. The day the engagement was announced down at the store, Eli was there and he heard, and his face did a complicated thing for about half a second, and then he said, "I heard him. That's real good. She deserves somebody who'll take care of her." And he meant it. He bought his fencing staples and he went home. That is the kind of man we are dealing with. I want you to know that before you find out what he does, because the doing only means something if you understand the man it cost. Word travels in a valley faster than weather. By Friday, 2 days after Royce drove off in his cloud of windless dust, everybody knew. The church got a call. The pie got unbaked. The folding chairs stayed folded. And the story got handed around the way these stories do, picking up its shape from the mouths that carried it, and the shape it settled into was this. Royce Aldridge came to his senses. Can't blame a man for wanting children. Shame, but she's no spring chicken. She had to know it was a long shot at her age. I heard that sentence, or its cousin, maybe a dozen times that week. At her age. As though 46 were a crime she'd committed against Royce personally. As though the years she'd spent keeping that ranch alive and burying her dead and asking nobody for anything were a debt that had finally come due. I am an old man and I have learned to keep my mouth shut about most things, but I came close, that week, to losing some friendships over it. There's a particular cruelty in how a place decides a woman is finished. It doesn't come with horns. It comes with sympathy. Poor Lena. Shame about her age. It comes from people who'd swear they were on her side. Lena heard it too. Of course she did. She came into town that Saturday, the Saturday she was supposed to be married, because she'd run low on chicken feed and she was not going to let a thing like a public humiliation keep her birds hungry. She walked into the co-op in her work coat with her chin up, and the place went quiet the way a room does, and she bought her feed and she carried it out herself and loaded it herself, and she drove home. 40 pounds of layer pellets on the most ruined day of her adult life. I know because I was there. I tried to carry the bag. She let me, then took it back at the truck, and she said, "Lo, just for me. If I let you carry it, Cole, they'll all be sure I'm broke. I'm not broke. I just have to keep my own things in my own hands a while, you understand me." I understood her. Keep your own things in your own hands. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything anybody ever said to me. What I didn't see, what I only found out later, when Eli finally told me the whole of it on a different porch, a happier porch, with a different light, was that he'd been in the co-op parking lot that Saturday too, sitting in his truck. He'd come to town to buy nothing in particular, the way he did when his house got too quiet, and he'd seen the whole thing. Seen Lena carry her own 40 pounds with her chin up while the town watched her be a widow to a marriage that never happened. And something in Eli Reyes, who had spent 6 years being careful, who had spent 2 years inventing fence to be near a woman he'd never speak to, who had told himself 100 times that his hands were too crooked, and his name too quiet, and his deserving too small. Something in him stood up. He told me later it didn't feel like courage. He said it felt like the opposite. He said it felt like being so angry at the whole sorry world that the fear just got crowded out, the way a flood crowds the field mice up onto the high ground whether they plan to climb or not. He said he sat in that truck and watched her drive away, and he thought one clear thought, the clearest he'd had in years. Somebody should tell her she's not what they're saying she is, and there's nobody left to do it but me. He didn't go after her that day. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't going to chase a heartbroken woman down a county road. But that Saturday is the day Eli stopped watching. I've marked it in my own ledger after the fact, dated it as best I could. The Saturday she carried her own feed. That's the day the second half of this story started, though neither of them knew it, and I sure didn't. That night I drove out to Lena's. I told myself it was to check on her. The truth is I couldn't stand my own empty house, with my polished boots by the door that weren't going to walk anybody anywhere now. Her kitchen light was on. I knocked. She let me in, and she had a glass of her father's bourbon poured, the bottle he'd left that she kept for funerals and never touched otherwise, and she had the wedding dress laid out on the kitchen table. Pale gray. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at it, smoothing the fabric with one weathered hand, over and over, the way you gentle a spooked animal. "I'm not going to cry about him," she said, before I'd even sat down. "He's not worth the salt." She kept smoothing the dress. "I'm going to cry about something else, and I'd be obliged if you'd let me call it him." "All right," I said. I sat down. I didn't ask what the something else was. I think I knew. It wasn't Royce. Royce was a coward with a truck. The something else was bigger than Royce and meaner. It was the word the whole valley had agreed on, too old, the verdict that didn't come from one man but from all of them, from the air, from the years, the official notice that she was past being chosen, and that she'd been a fool to think otherwise, even for one gold October. She poured me a glass without asking. We sat in her kitchen and drank her dead father's bourbon, and after a while she said, not looking at me, "Was I stupid, Cole? To think somebody'd want me at this age?" "And I want to tell you I said something wise. I want to tell you I told her about Eli, that I'd put it all together, that I sent her hope across that kitchen table like a thrown rope. I didn't know yet, not really, not the size of it. And I'm not a wise man. I'm a man who counts fence posts that don't need counting. So I just said the only true thing I had. I said, 'No, Lena, you weren't stupid. The world's stupid. You were just brave enough to hope in front of it, and it punished you for it, the way it does.'" She nodded. She drank. And then she folded that gray dress up, careful, into a square, and she set it on the chair by the door, and she said, "I'll take it back to town Monday. Get my money." She never did take it back. I found that out later, too. That dress stayed folded on that chair for the better part of a year, and the reason she never returned it is the reason this whole story turns from a sad one into the other kind. But that's part two. And part two starts with a man knocking on a door he never thought he'd have the right to knock on, holding a sack of hard little pears, with his crooked hands shaking worse than Lena's had on the day her engagement died. I was wrong about the wind that day. I'm telling you that on purpose. Remember it. Because I was about to be wrong about a great deal more, about Lena, about endings, about who gets to be loved and when. And the only thing I'd get right in the end was that somebody with eyes was going to see her. He stood at the foot of her porch steps for 11 minutes before he knocked. I know it was 11 because he told me, and Eli was not a man who exaggerated. If he said 11, it was 11, counted out in his head the way he counted hammer strokes when he was driving a shoe so he wouldn't think about the pain in his hands. It was a Sunday, the dead middle of November, about 2 weeks after the Knott wedding, cold enough that his breath stood in front of his face and didn't move on account of the no wind. I keep telling you about the wind. There's a reason. He'd brought the pears, a paper sack of them, the little hard winter pears off the tree his Connie had planted before she got sick, the tree he'd never been able to bring himself to cut down even though the pears were too sour to do much with. He'd brought them because he had to bring something, and they were the only thing he owned that he'd grown with his own hands. And a man like Eli doesn't show up at a woman's door empty-handed. And he sure doesn't show up at it with flowers, which would have said the thing out loud before he was ready to. So, pears. A grown man with crooked hands and a dead wife, standing in the cold holding a sack of sour pears, working up the nerve to knock on the door of a woman the whole county had just finished declaring unwantable. He told me he almost left 4 times. He said the 5th time he didn't leave was because Lena's old blue heeler, Pete, came around the corner of the house and saw him and started barking, and then there was no leaving, because leaving would have looked exactly like the cowardice he was there to stand against. So he knocked. Lena opened the door in her father's flannel shirt and a pair of reading glasses pushed up in her hair, with a pen behind her ear because she'd been doing the books, the grim arithmetic of a boarding stable in winter, which never came out the way you wanted no matter how many times you ran it. She looked at Eli. She looked at the pears. And the first thing out of her mouth, Eli said, was, "Is something wrong with one of the horses?" Because that was the only reason a man came to her door. A horse, a broken thing, never her. "No," Eli said, "the horses are fine." Then what? And then she stopped, because she saw his face, and Lena Whitcomb had buried enough people to know when a man's face was doing something it didn't usually get to do. He held out the pears. His hand was shaking. He told himself he had a whole speech, he said, something dignified, something that wouldn't embarrass either one of them. And the speech left him entirely the second the door opened, the way speeches do, and what came out instead was the worst organized truth a man ever spoke on a cold porch. "I heard what Royce did, and what everybody's saying about your age," he swallowed. "And I needed to come tell you that they've got it wrong, all of them. I've watched you for 2 years, Lena, and I don't mean it like that. I mean I've seen you, the way you do things, the way you carry your own feed and pull your own calves, and you never once asked anybody to feel sorry for you, and I think." His voice gave out. He stood there with the pears between them like an offering at a grave. "I think you're the finest thing in this whole valley," he said, "and I think any man who looked at you and saw an age instead of a woman ought to be ashamed to call himself one. That's all. That's what I came to say. I brought pears because I didn't know what else." He stopped. His ears were red. "They're sour," he added miserably. "I should have. They're real sour. I'm sorry." And then he just stood there, having said the most words anyone had heard out of Eli Reyes in 6 years, certain he'd made a fool of himself, certain she'd shut the door, ready for it, braced for it the way you brace for a horse to come down on your foot. Lena didn't shut the door. Lena looked at this quiet, careful man with his ruined hands and his sour pears and his ears gone red in the cold. And she did the thing that she told me, much later, she had not done in front of another person since her father's funeral. She cried. Not pretty, not a single tear down a cheek. She put one hand over her mouth, and she cried the way you cry when something you'd given up on turns out to have been real the whole time. Great ugly heaving sobs that bent her near in half, standing in her own doorway in her dead father's shirt. And Eli, who had braced for the door and gotten this instead, did the only thing his body knew to do. He dropped the pears, They spilled and rolled all over the porch boards, every one of them, and the dog went to snuffling at them. And he stepped up onto the porch and he put his bad arms around her, careful, so careful, the way he'd hold a foal, and he let her cry into his coat. And he didn't say anything else. He'd said it all. The pears rolled around their feet and the dog ate two of them, and the cold breath of two people stood unmoving in the air, mingling, going nowhere, the way breath does when there's no wind to take it. That's how it started. A sack of dropped pears and a man who'd watched her for 2 years, and a woman the world had declared finished, finding out at the same moment that finished was a thing other people had decided, not a thing that was true. Now, I'd love to tell you it was easy after that. It was not easy after that. This is the part the feed store version skips, the part where the story stops being a fairy tale and starts being two scared middle-aged people trying to figure out how to want something again without dying of the risk. For one thing, Lena didn't trust it. How could she? 2 weeks earlier a man had looked her in the face and called her too old to bother with, in front of God and the cottonwoods, and now here was another man saying the opposite, and the wound was so fresh that the kindness hurt, the way warm water hurts a hand that's been out in the cold too long. She told me she lay awake that whole first week sure that Eli was going to come to his senses too. That he'd wake up some morning and do the Royce arithmetic, children, heirs, futures, and drive away in his own cloud of dust. She kept waiting for it. She kept braced for it. She told me she'd catch herself being happy and then yank the happiness back like touching a hot stove, because she didn't think she'd survive being put down twice. So she was hard on him that first month, tested him, picked fights about nothing. Once she sent him home over a thing so small I won't even repeat it, just to see if he'd come back, and he came back the next morning before she was up and split a week's worth of stovewood and left it stacked and was gone before she came out. No note, nothing, just the wood. And she stood there in her bathrobe looking at that stack of split wood and understood that this was a different kind of man than she'd been braced for. For another thing, and this is the part that costs the most to tell, the Valley did not approve. You'd think they would. You'd think a place that had just clucked its tongue over poor old Lena getting jilted would be glad to see her with a good man. They were not glad. A woman is supposed to take her medicine. A woman who's been declared finished is supposed to go quietly into her finishing, get a few more cats, fade out polite. When she does the other thing, when she gets loved anyway, out loud in defiance of the verdict, it makes the people who pass the verdict feel like fools. And people would rather you suffered than that they felt like fools. So the talk turned. Did you hear Lena Whitcomb's taken up with Eli Reyes? Quick, isn't it? 2 weeks, almost like she was waiting, as if a grieving woman finding comfort were a crime when the same mouths had just spent a year saying she'd be lucky to find anybody at all, and him with those hands. What's he going to give her? He can barely hold a hammer, pair of broke down old, I won't finish it. I heard the end of that sentence in the co-op and I did, finally that time, lose a friendship over it. I told a man I'd known 40 years that he could keep his opinions about Lena Whitcomb behind his teeth or he could say them to me outside. And I'm 71 years old and I meant it. And he saw that I meant it. And that was the end of 40 years. I don't regret it. Some friendships aren't worth the price of keeping quiet. The hardest thing, though, the morally heavy thing, the choice I promised you, came in February. And it came not at Lena but at Eli. And it nearly ended the whole business before it had a fair chance to live. Here's what happened. Royce Aldridge, it turned out, had not gotten his heir. The girl his mother lined up for him, younger, suitable, from a family with land that bordered theirs, came and went by Christmas, because it turns out that the qualities that make a man jilt a 46-year-old woman over her age are not qualities that make a man easy to love at any age. Royce got dumped, the way he dumped, and being a small man he needed somewhere to put it. And he found out, the way you find out everything in a valley, that Lena had landed soft, with Eli, and it ate at him. The idea that the woman he'd thrown back as too old had been caught by another man and was, by every account, happy, it ate at Royce Aldridge alive. So Royce did a small, mean, expensive thing, the kind only a man with money can do. Eli, you'll remember, made his living on the ranches around here, scraping it together one job at a time. Royce put the word out. Quiet, nothing you could prove, just, I wouldn't hire Reyes if I were you. Hands like that doing your shoeing, liability. And he's not all there since the wife. I heard he's getting forgetful. None of it true. All of it deadly in a place where work moves by reputation and reputation moves by whisper. Within a month, 3 of Eli's regular ranches had found other farriers. By March he was hurting. Not complaining, Eli would have died before he complained, but hurting. I could see it. His truck was getting old and he wasn't fixing it. He was eating poor. And here's the choice. Eli figured out where it was coming from. It wasn't hard. And he had in his hands, his bad, crooked, honest hands, the power to hurt Royce back. Because Eli knew things. He'd shod for everybody. He knew which of Royce's prize bulls had a feed-room secret Royce wouldn't want the cattle buyers knowing, knew it firsthand, could have dropped one sentence at the right sale and cost Royce Aldridge more money than Royce had cost him 100 times over. A man with less in him would have. A man with more fear and less heart would have called it justice. And God knows Eli had earned the right. He came to me about it. That's the only time in this whole story Eli came asking. He sat in my kitchen and turned his coffee cup around and around with those poor fingers, and he laid it out, what Royce was doing, what he could do back, and he said, "Cole, tell me why I shouldn't." And I'm ashamed to say I didn't have a good answer at first. Part of me wanted him to do it. Part of me wanted Royce Aldridge laid low, badly, in public, for what he'd done to Lena on that porch. I sat there wanting it. But then I thought about Lena standing in her doorway crying into Eli's coat, about the pears rolling on the boards, about the kind of man it takes to hold a sobbing woman like a foal and say nothing because he'd already said everything. And I said the only thing I had, which was the thing my late wife would have said, which is maybe why it came out right. Because the second you do it, you become the kind of man she's already had. You'd be Royce. You'd just be Royce with a better reason, and there's no such thing as a better reason. There's only the thing you become while you're telling yourself you've got one. I drank my coffee. And she'd know, maybe not how, but women like Lena always know when the man across the table has turned into somebody who'd do that. And it'd cost you her, slow. You'd lose her a half-inch at a time and you'd never figure out why. Eli sat with that a long while. The clock ticked. His hands turned the cup. Then he stood up and he put his hat on and he said, "I'll go pick up some shifts at the sale barn. Mucking. My hands can still hold a shovel." And he went and did exactly that. A 60-year-old man who'd been a respected farrier for 40 years, shoveling manure at the sale barn for cash, because he decided that being poor and clean was worth more than being whole and dirty. He never said a word of it to Lena. She found out months later from me, and the way she looked when she found out, well, that's a thing I'll get to. He never used what he knew about Royce. Took it to his grave eventually, far as I know. That's the morally heavy thing, not what he did. What he didn't do, when doing it would have been so easy and felt so much like fairness. There's a kind of man who's measured not by his blows, but by the blows he had every right to throw and didn't. Eli was that kind. I've known maybe 3 of them in my life. By spring, the thing between them had quit being fragile and started being real. I'd see them out in the long evenings, the 2 of them, fixing the fence that Eli had been inventing reasons to fix for 2 years, except now there was no inventing. Now it was just theirs to fix, and they did it side by side and you could hear them. Not the words, just the sound of 2 people who'd stopped bracing. Her laugh came back. The belly laugh, the one that surprised her. I heard it carry across the fields one April evening, and I stopped my truck on the county road just to listen to it. An old man parked in the dusk, eavesdropping on the sound of a woman being happy after the world had told her she was done. He moved slow. Eli moved slow with everything. It was the only speed his hands allowed, and it had become the speed of his whole self. He didn't propose for a long time. Lena told me she'd half decided he never would, and that she'd made her peace with it, because what they had didn't need a church and a cracked bell to be true. I had the church version offered to me, she said, and look how that went. I'd rather have the porch version. The porch version's the only one that showed up when I was crying. But here's the thing I have to tell you, and it's why this isn't a tidy story with a tidy bow. Why I started by warning you it gets worse before it gets better and then maybe worse again. In May, Eli started forgetting things. Small at first, a tool left behind, a road he'd driven 1,000 times missed. Lena thought it was the tiredness, the sail barn shifts on top of the farrier work he'd started getting back as Royce's whisper finally died down. Then it was bigger. He drove to my place one afternoon and sat in his truck in my yard for a while and then came in and asked me, polite as anything, if I knew whose place this was, because he'd been heading to Lena's and he'd somehow ended up somewhere he didn't recognize. He was in my yard. He'd been to my place 200 times. The whisper Royce started. I heard he's getting forgetful. The cruel lie Royce had made up out of nothing to break a good man's living. It was, by the most savage coincidence I've ever witnessed, starting to come true. That's where part 2 has to leave it, because that's where I had to leave it that May, standing in my own yard, watching the finest quiet man I ever knew look at me with friendly confusion and ask me where he was. And I had to decide, right then, with my heart going like a trapped bird, whether to tell Lena what I was seeing, and hand the woman who'd already been declared finished once a second, slower, crueler verdict to brace against. I'm not going to tell you what I decided. Not yet. You've earned the right to find out, but you'll have to take it the way I had to take it, one hard day at a time. I want that on the record first, because I spent a lot of years afterwards second-guessing it, and I've come down, finally, on the side of having done right. But I'll tell you it was the hardest knock I ever delivered, harder than the news of her brother, harder than anything, because this time I was the one holding the verdict, and the verdict was, the good thing that finally came to you is going to be taken away, and slow, and there's no fixing it. I drove out the day after Eli sat in my yard not knowing where he was. Lena was in the round pen working a young horse, and she stopped when she saw my face, because by then she knew my faces the way I knew hers. She came to the rail. She didn't say anything. She just waited with her gloved hands on the top rail and her chin already lifting, getting ready, bracing. God, the practice that woman had at bracing. I told her what I'd seen, the forgetting my yard. Road he missed. I told her I wasn't a doctor and it could be nothing and it was probably worth getting him looked at, and I heard my own voice doing the thing voices do when they're trying to soften a stone, and I made myself stop softening it because she'd earned the truth straight. So I said it straight. Lena, I think something's wrong with Eli, the kind of wrong that doesn't get better, and I thought you ought to hear it from somebody who loves you both before you had to figure it out alone in the dark some night. She stood at that rail a long time. The colt fidgeted and she gentled it without looking, one hand, automatic, 20 years of habit, and then she said a thing I did not expect. She said, "How long do you think we've got?" Not "are you sure?" Not "it can't be." Not even tears, not yet. Just how long? Like a woman reading a weather sky and deciding whether she had time to get the hay in. And I understood, standing there, that Lena Whitcomb had already done all her bracing for one lifetime, and that somewhere in the last 6 months she'd quietly run out of the strength to flinch, and that what was left when the flinching ran out wasn't weakness. It was the other thing. The thing that looks like calm and is actually the deepest kind of courage there is. The kind that's done arguing with what's true and has moved on to the harder work of what do we do about it. I don't know, I said. Could be slow, could be years. I just know it doesn't go the other way. She nodded. She climbed through the rails, and she said, "Then I'd better marry him while he still knows my name." They got the diagnosis in June. I won't put the doctor's words down. The words don't matter, and Eli would have hated them taking up space. What matters is what he said when he understood it. Lena told me. They were in the truck in the clinic lot, and Eli sat there with his crooked hands in his lap, and he said, and you have to picture this man, 60 years old, who'd shoveled manure rather than become Royce, who'd watched her for 2 years before he dared to speak. He said, "I want you to leave me, Lena, now, while it's still your choice and not a duty. You buried enough people. I'm not going to be one more thing that uses you up. Go on. I'll understand. I'll be glad you did, even when I can't remember why." And Lena Whitcomb, who had been thrown back once for being too old to be worth a future, looked at the man who was now offering to throw himself back for the same reason. "Don't spend your future on me. I'm not worth what's left of it." And she started to laugh. The belly laugh. In the clinic parking lot on the worst day, she laughed until she cried and cried until she laughed, and when she could finally talk, she said, "Eli Reyes, 2 men in one lifetime have now tried to leave me to save me from a future. The first one I let go because I believed him that I wasn't worth it. I am not." And here she took his ruined hands in both of hers, careful, the way he'd held her, making that mistake twice. "You don't get to decide what I'm worth spending myself on. I already decided. I decided on a cold porch with pears rolling all over the ground. So you can shut up about leaving and you can marry me, and we will take whatever's coming the way we take everything else around here. Together, with our own things in our own hands." He didn't have anything for that. Good men never do either. They make the decision in the dark of their love, and then somebody turns on the light and shows them they were loved back the whole time. They married in September, almost a year to the day from that gold October when Royce had asked her on the same porch. Not at the white church. On her porch, his porch now too, the one where the pears had rolled. I walked her out the kitchen door and across the boards, which is closer than down an aisle and meant more. She wore the pale gray dress, the one she'd never returned. She told me that day why she'd never taken it back. I kept thinking I was a fool for keeping it. Every month I'd think, "Take it back, get your money, you old fool," that ship sailed. And every month I'd leave it on the chair. I think some part of me was just stubborn, wouldn't let the world have the last word on it. And look, she smoothed the gray fabric the way she'd smoothed it that first awful night. Turns out I was keeping it for the right wedding, just didn't know it yet. Eli stood at the end of the porch in his good shirt with his hat in his hands, and his hands were steady that day, I swear they were. And when she came out the door, he looked at her the way. I don't have the words. I'm a man who writes the weather in a canvas book, but I'll try. He looked at her the way you look at the one thing in your whole life that the world told you you didn't get to have, standing in front of you anyway in a gray dress, saying yes. He looked at her like a man who'd been right about something everyone else got wrong, because he had been. He'd looked at a woman the entire valley had marked finished and seen the finest thing in it, and the looking turned out to be the truest thing he ever did. It was a small wedding. Me and the doctor's wife who'd grown fond of them, and the new young preacher who didn't know the old story and so didn't bring it. There was no cracked bell. There was a blue heeler named Pete who ate, I'm not making this up, 2 pears off the tree before the vows were done. There was a woman laughing the belly laugh, and a quiet man with steady hands for one good day, and an old fool reading the weather of it all and writing it down later so it'd be remembered right. I wrote that night, married, gray dress. His hands didn't shake. Pete ate the pears. The wind came up at sundown finally after a whole year of standing still, and it took the heat off the day, and it was the best wind I ever felt. You want to know about Royce? People always do. There's not much. He sold up 2 years later and moved to Arizona, where I'm told he got a younger wife and a heart condition in that order. I don't think about him much. He was never the story. He was just the weather that came through and broke a thing open so a better thing could grow in the break. That's all most cruelty is in the end if you live long enough to see past it. Weather. Bad weather that thinks it's the whole sky. You want to know about Eli? That's harder. It went the way the doctor said. Slow and then less slow. He kept his hands a good while. The body memory of 40 years of shoeing stayed in those crooked fingers long after the names started leaving him. And there were mornings, more than you'd think, when he was all there completely himself. And those mornings Lena guarded like gold and didn't waste a one. He forgot the road to my place for good. He forgot eventually that Connie had died and would ask after her, and Lena, this is the part that takes the wind out of me still. Lena never once corrected him. She'd just say Connie was fine. Connie was out in the garden and let him be glad, because she decided early that her job was not to keep him in the true world but to keep him in a kind one. She told me, It costs me nothing to let him think his first wife's alive. He doesn't know she's the woman before me. In his head we're all just the people who love him. Why would I take that? There came a day, near the end of what I'll tell you about, when he didn't know Lena's name. She'd been braced for that one her whole life, in a way. The day she'd finally become invisible to the one set of eyes that had truly seen her. She told me she dreaded it more than the diagnosis itself. And when it came, she said, it wasn't what she dreaded at all. Because Eli looked at her across the kitchen, this woman whose name was gone, and his face did a thing. She said it did the exact thing it had done on the porch the first day, the complicated half-second, the lighting up, and he said, to a woman he could no longer name, "You're the finest thing in this whole valley. Anybody ever tell you that?" He didn't know her name, but the man knew, all the way down past where names live, that the woman in his kitchen was the thing his whole heart had organized itself around. And he told her so, the same words like the river finding the same channel it always finds. Lena said she sat down on the kitchen floor right where she was standing, and she didn't cry the ugly way that time. She cried the other way, the good way. The way you cry when the world tried twice to tell you you weren't worth being seen, and you find out, on the kitchen floor, that you were seen so deep it outlasted the man's own mind. I'm an old man. I've buried about everyone, the way you do if you're stubborn enough to stay. I count fence posts that don't need counting, and I write the weather in a book, and I've got polished boots by the door that have now walked 2 people somewhere good, which is more than most boots get to say. People ask me when the old story comes up, because it still comes up, the feed store version, the one about the woman who got jilted for her age. They ask me how it ended. And they always mean Royce. They mean the jilting. To them that's the whole story, the cruelty, the verdict, the poor old woman and the cracked bell that never rang. I tell them they've got the wrong end of it. The jilting wasn't the story. The jilting was just the door slamming so hard it blew another door open. The story is a sack of sour pears on a cold porch. The story is a man who had every right to ruin the man who ruined him, and didn't, and shoveled manure instead. The story is a gray dress kept out of pure stubbornness for a wedding nobody knew was coming. The story is you're the finest thing in this whole valley. Anybody ever tell you that? Said by a man who couldn't recall his own name but would not lose her. The story is that the world is wrong about who's finished. The world is wrong about it almost every single time. Lena's still out there. The horses are mostly gone now. She's older than I was when this all started, hard as that is to write, but she keeps a few. She keeps the pear tree. It's a terrible tree. The pears are still too sour to eat, and every fall she lets them drop and rot in the grass, and she won't hear a word about cutting it down. I asked her once why she keeps a tree that's never given her a thing worth eating. She looked at me like I was simple, which, where this is concerned, I am. It gave me everything, she said. And she went back to her work with her own things in her own hands, the way she'd want me to leave her, the way I'll leave you. With the wind just coming up, after a long stillness, taking the heat off the end of the day.